Hello. In this tutorial we're going to focus on your basic data types. So to begin with, what I'd like to do is introduce the concept of float. And a floating point value is one in which we can have a decimal, and we're going to expand the type of numbers that we can store above the integer, which we talked about in the last tutorial. So let's imagine that we wanted to store your GPA. I could create this floating point value called GPA. And the model of this is I'm going to give the variable type here and then the name of the variable here. So now I have a variable called GPA of type float, and let's ask the user what their GPA is. If only it were that easy, right? So what is your GPA? And we're going to use the write command to leave that cursor on that same line. And then we could say that the GPA is equal to console readline. But remember, the read line returns a string, so we're going to have to convert that into something of the float type. Because GPA is float and console readline is returning string, I need to use float.parse, and very similar to that int32 parse, it's going to take in this string and convert it, in this case, into a floating point value and store it into that variable called GPA. Okay, so now I have the variable GPA, and let's imagine that I want to print this back out and say your GPA is, and then add to it that variable GPA, and it's going to do string concatenation, so it's going to take whatever is stored in this variable and display it to the screen. So let's run this, and what we'll get is the prompt that says what is your GPA, and let's say I have a 3.9, and then it displays it back to us. Well, that's interesting, but let's actually do some basic arithmetic here and say that GPA is equal to GPA plus 0.5. I'd like to give myself a half a letter grade boost. And then we're going to display that back out and say your GPA after the boost is whatever that GPA. Okay, so up here it's going to print out whatever the value is when GPA was typed in from the user, but as we go down our program from top to bottom, we're going to modify that and then we're going to redisplay it. So let's run it and we'll get an error, and I did this on purpose so that I could demonstrate to you the difference between a float and what it's complaining about here is a double, because 0.5 is implicitly a double value, meaning it takes twice as much memory as a float. And the reason for that is, by definition, the default for all floating point values here, or decimal values, is a double. I can convert this explicitly into a float by using this f suffix, and then if I run this, all will be well, because I'm taking a floating point value and adding to it another floating point value. So you can think of as a float as a decimal number that has a specific range and precision, and a double data type has twice that amount of memory, so it increases the precision and it increases that range of values that we can store in it. Okay, now let's run this, and what we'll get is the prompt asking us for our GPA. Let's imagine that I have a 3.4, and then after the boost I'm going to get a 3.9 as we expect. Great. Okay, so let's continue on, and now let's talk about an example where I actually use that double data type. Let's imagine that I wanted to sort your salary, and into salary I want to place the value 45,050 cents because every little bit counts, right? And then I can do a console write line on salary and make sure that your variable names are spelled right, as well as use the same capitalization. So here this is lowercase s salary, so I need to use it later as lowercase s salary, otherwise I'll get an error. So let's imagine that I incorrectly produced a capital S, and you see that it's going to complain that this doesn't exist because I don't match. Alright, let's run this and we get our prompt for our GPA. Let's say we got our 3.4 again, and notice that now it's printing out our salary, this 45,050, and it truncates that last zero. There are a couple ways of modifying the output, but for what you need to know now, just realize that the double can store larger numbers and also numbers with higher significant digits. Okay, in addition to the float and the double, we also have the Boolean data type, or abbreviated as bool, and this stores variables that can either be true or false. So we could say is female is true. And also we have our character data type. Let's imagine that I want to store your middle initial, and I can do it like so. So the character, or char, is going to store a single character, and notice I use my single quotations here whereas with my strings I was using double quotations, and my bool data type can either store true or false. And that'll do it for basic primitive data types.